Welcome to the Bioethics Babe podcast, where we examine the tough questions in human flourishing in light of science, faith, and culture. I'm your host, Darina Grosso-Agnew. Now let's dive in. Kimberly Cook is the author of Motherhood Redeemed, How Radical Feminism Betrayed Maternal Love, a book that exposes how feminist ideology distorted the very heart of what makes women flourish. She's also the host of the Dignity of Women podcast, where she dives deep into the spiritual, cultural, and bioethical questions shaping the lives of women today. Kimberly holds an MA in systematic theology, and she's become a powerful voice, reclaiming authentic femininity and challenging the narratives that have left so many women confused, exhausted, and longing for something more. On her Substack, she writes with honesty, clarity, and conviction, inviting women into a deeper understanding of their identity, their gifts, and their vocation. She lives in Virginia with her husband and their 5 children, and brings both intellectual depth and lived experience to this conversation. Today, she joins us to talk about the crisis facing modern womanhood, the beauty and strength of maternal love, and why redeeming motherhood may be the key to healing our culture. Welcome to the show, Kimberly.
Thanks so much for having me, Irina. It's a gift.
Kimberly, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your background and how you got here. Could you tell us a little bit about your understanding of womanhood and motherhood growing up?
Yes, well, I think that my story is similar to a lot of modern American young women today, and maybe not so young women as well. But for me, it was a loosely religious childhood. For us, it was loosely Catholic. And I was raised in the public school system. So for me, one of the things that I heard over and over again, the narrative that I gravitated towards was the narrative that of modern feminism, that women were oppressed, that their voice was subdued, and that they were subjected in society, and that I needed to take a powerful part in reclaiming my authority as a woman in society, my place. And it really put me on the defensive as I was coming into my teen years. I would say the formation that kind of started to run through my veins was this idea of power, that I needed to be indestructible personally, but also in the world, that I couldn't show any weakness, that I had to take on a very, I would say, masculine spiritual identity when we see that the strength and the ability to face the world and not to really have what Edith Stein shows us, that kind of personalism towards others, seeing others and having that compassion and identity, and slowing down and stopping to notice and recognize and make space for the other. I learned that I needed to shut that part of myself down in order to, in essence, compete with other powerhouses, whether they were men or women. But I felt this strong urge and this constant need to power my way through the structure of society. And that was my formation through high school, which really led me into many of the modern fallacies that affect what's been constructed as feminism.
Mm-hmm. And were there any early experiences that you can remember that kind of gave you that message to begin with?
I would say a lot of the teachers that I encountered in my high school had a lot of those ideologies that they passed on. So I think looking back, I would say originally it was reading, Aristotle and some of the early philosophers from an early age and not having good guidance with reading that. So being allowed to form my own opinions and seeing, first of all, some of the negativity towards women, right, in those early writings, and instantly being on guard about that. Also, having scripture used in it as a weapon, almost as a defense, like as Eve was the woman who allowed humanity to fall. And you can use that as a weapon if you're not theologically learned about Genesis. So you can say, women caused the fall of man, and women is kind of behind all of these great falls. Women is the temptress, and you can really go down some dark paths with that. And so I think with not having a good basis to understand the philosophy that I was given at an early age, not having a good theological basis to understand Genesis, and then also for me, I was very much influenced by 19th century writers. So Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, Louisa May Alcott, Frances Hodgson Burnett. So I loved literature, and I loved these 19th century British women who used their writing as a way to expose the wrongs of women, how women were not able to have any kind of inheritance. Women were not able to have a certain education. They weren't able to marry for love. It was all about money. So some of the issues that they exposed that were very problematic at the time and, were keeping women in this state of subjection, all of these things together formed this, understanding in my mind that women needed to make a better path forward, and that we needed to, in essence, fight for our position, because we couldn't allow ourselves to slide back into these positions that we had been put in the past.
Mhm. And you have spoken about searching for your identity in all the wrong places. What did that season of life look like for you?
So, as you can imagine, it was very dark and angry. I mean, there was no life, there was no joy. When you're constantly fighting for power or authority, and in essence, what I didn't know at the time, but fighting against my own nature, trying to conform myself to the world, trying to conform into something that was not who I was as a woman, who I was created by God to be, even as a human being, as a child of God, as, a feminine soul. All of these things I didn't understand. So when I was taking those influences, which were all in essence really good and life giving, but when I was not given proper wisdom and understanding to decipher those influences, and yet I was listening to these other voices, as I said, some of the teachers that I was learning from in high school. And then also I made other friends in high school that were feminists, self-proclaimed feminists. And I was starting to read a lot of the literature that they were passing on to me, this feminist literature. And so I even started to adopt some of these really harmful ideologies that I was rejecting, out and out rejecting my body and my femininity, starting to think that these things that God had given us, for instance, our fertility, number one, was a curse, that this was something that proved that God did not love women, and as much as men, at least, and that this fertility actually kept us down as women, and it closed so many doors for us because we weren't able to achieve the same things as men. And also just the looking at it in all of the wrong ways, like, well, it's painful and it's messy, and it's, not looking at it from the proper perspective of beauty and life giving and the gift and the elevation and the model of the Blessed Mother, and not seeing any of that when you totally strip the maternal, which had been done, when you totally strip God's gift and God, in essence, from the story at all, then here's what you have is just looking at this as something that is so negative, so violently cast upon women. And I started to see myself as someone who was very unloved by God because I was given this nature as a woman. So 50-50, I could have, 50% of us are men, 50% of us are women. And I was put into this category that was lesser. So I even started to adopt this antithesis of Christian teaching, and this almost anger started to develop towards God or towards this, creator who, if there was somebody who had made me, then he had chosen the lesser for me.
Hmm. We're taught to believe that feminism is empowering, and the question is, did you feel empowered during this phase of feminism, or did you feel restless? What were your underlying emotions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do think there is a sense of feeling empowered because you are building this structure around yourself. In essence, for me, it was building walls around my heart. I
Mm.
felt like I was developing this strength, this internal and external strength of character, spirit, resilience. And so for me, those were the virtues, if you will, that were most important in developing as a young woman. And those are what I was dedicated to developing. And I think that because I felt that that was virtue itself, I felt like I was on the right track. And I think there was a sense of empowerment also because there's such a need for us as human beings to be part of community. When we don't have that community elsewhere, in essence, the church or any kind of, tie to a religious community, we do need to seek it elsewhere. And we often find it in, other places. And for me, finding a group of dedicated women who were trying to do the same thing that I was and that were really feeding into this feminist culture of resilience and strength and power, it it felt good to be part of a community. So I will say there was that piece of the puzzle. However, there was so much anger, darkness, depression within that. And I didn't know that there was any other way. I didn't know that there was any other possible way to cultivate this kind of virtue and not have this anger. So I think that, and eventually that would have been the tipping point for me, is to realize that I couldn't go on in this direction, be it right or wrong. There had to be another way.
And that leads me to the question, how did you find the other way? Was there a single turning point, or was there a series of small awakenings? And who or what first cracked open the door for you spiritually?
Right. Well, I think, of course, the Lord is always giving us seeds. He's always planting seeds. That's always happening, whether we realize it or not. And there definitely were seeds. When I look back, I see seeds planted all through high school. One of the big things, of course, is abortion, which when I faced abortion as a high schooler, again, coming from a feminist perspective and being influenced by other feminist voices around me who were all embracing abortion as a necessary, it would have been said for us as a necessary evil. Of course, now you can't say evil when you talk about abortion because that's just considered to be basic women's health care. But for me, it was seen as a necessary evil, I would say. And when I say that, most of us thought that abortion was not the best case scenario. It was not, something that you would just opt for in the same sense as contraception, not just like a backup plan. But, you could not deny something like that to women because they needed that reproductive freedom to pursue their lives and their careers and their education. And if that was an impediment in their specific situation in life, then they needed to be able to have that to resort to. So for me, I think abortion was a big way that the Lord started to plant those seeds. I remember a young girl that I worked with when I was a teenager. She was the same age as me, but she was very outspoken against abortion when all the rest of us around her were, going along with the narrative that women needed this and it wasn't the best, but it needed to be an option. And I was so amazed by, first of all, her ability to come against the group of us, because any woman knows that it is so hard to come against a group of women with an opposing voice, especially when it's a strong and condemning opposing voice. And when it's on a topic that is a hot topic like abortion, it is very hard and takes a lot of courage to be that opposing voice in that group. And she just did it in a way that embodied so much grace. And I think for me, just her patient, quiet stance on that was one of the first seeds that was planted, just to see that a woman could stand in strength, in a different kind of strength than I had seen before. It was really like a Blessed Mother strength, it was powerful, but kind of silent, just said what needed to be said and then sat back and let it resonate. And it did the job for me. I don't know what it did for the other people, but that has always stuck with me. And then there would be other seeds that would continue to be planted along the way where, and again, to do with femininity, to do with my, my place in the world and my place in my own body and my place in theology as a woman. And in essence, that would continue to lead to fertility and maternity. And there was a moment then after these many kind of little seeds, but a moment after high school where I was really searching and I was starting to turn back to the idea that there must be another way, a better way. And I wound up meeting this man, Charles, my boyfriend at the time, who was atheist or agnostic at best, was working at a Catholic firm. It was just a graphic design firm, but it happened to be run by Italian Catholics who were very passionate and charismatic about their faith. And he suggested, since I was on this grand search for the truth, that I talk to his boss. And I was very reluctant because I thought, well, I've already checked off Catholicism. I'm searching for the truth, and Catholicism is what I was loosely raised, and I kind of already checked that off the list. But I decided to go, and I just had so much pride at the time that I thought I was going to convert this man. When I sat in front of him, I thought, okay, I'll be able to talk him out of Catholicism in 5 minutes flat, because that had been my experience in the past. Every time I had talked to a Catholic, I asked, why this, why that? Why do you go to confession? Why do you have to, follow these certain methods? And nobody could really give me a good, solid answer before that. And that's why I had not converted before that, because nobody had been able to give me a solid answer. But as I sat there, it was funny because I was ready for this theological battle and I had all my talking points ready, and I was, had myself with my stern face ready for that debate. And he just looked at me when I came in and said, "Do you realize that you are so loved?" And it was so disarming because I wasn't expecting that kind of start to the conversation at all. And I was really thrown off guard. And again, he said, God loves you so much that when he thinks about you, he shakes. And I just, started feeling those walls that I had built for all these years around my heart start to like wobble and crumble. And they were starting to like break down. And I just started sobbing and sobbing. And that's how our conversation or our debate started. It was what I really needed to know, and what I later understood that so many women need to know, and the basis for a lot of the fallacies that I had built upon was the fact that you're unloved by God, by the world, by your parents, maybe by whoever, whoever in your life, culture, boyfriends, who knows how many layers. But again, looking at the past, looking at all these forsaken women of the past, if you will, looking at early philosophers and what they had said, there's this message, if you look at it through the wrong scope, where if you don't have the wisdom to understand it through the eyes of God, there's a very condemning and subjective voice that is easy to believe. And And it again repeats the lie that we are unloved as women.
Hmm. So, speaking of the lies, what lies about motherhood did you believe? And when you had this conversion, what feminist messages did you have to unlearn?
Yes, that is tough because that actually did a lot of damage to me. I would say that did the most damage to me is pitting me against my motherhood and my maternal nature. So, hence the book that I wrote and the work that I've done and the message that I speak, because of the lived experience that I really went through. And the message that the lie, if you will, that I believed was that, first of all, that I'm not very feminine because I believed that I had a lot more male traits as far as being very outspoken, having very strong opinions, having a lot of ambitions that I wanted to pursue in life. All of those things seemed to me to be more masculine traits than feminine traits. And so it's funny because I was gravitating towards this postmodern feminist idea of equality. And yet I was saying that I'm, embodying more of the masculine traits. So here I am separating what are the masculine and feminine traits and saying that I embody more of the masculine. So here we are dividing and separating and, you know, unqualifying. But to me, that's what it meant. When I saw women that I felt were very feminine or maternal, that seemed to have this desire to just, want to be married and stay home with children, and they had this love for their femininity and their fertility, and they desired what I saw as a very shallow and unambitious future. When I saw women that was the sole purpose of their life, in a sense, to just get married and have children and create a home and a family. To me, that seemed so shallow, such a lack of ambition. And I really felt sorry for the women that believed that that was all that they were capable of. I saw them in almost a condemning way. And while I realized that women need to have children for society to continue, for humanity to continue, I almost thought that it was something for women that were uneducated, unambitious, or unable to pursue the true desires of their heart, maybe. So they were just settling for the most basic, um, female course of action that would almost be like an animalistic, okay, you reproduce and then you take care of your young. So I almost saw it as this like just basic human instinct that you were going to follow, as opposed to engaging your mind and your will and your intellect. And and so it, when I explored that further, it was a very derogatory view of femininity and maternity and family life, in essence. So the Lord had a lot of work to do in undoing that. There was a lot of healing that needed to take place, because then to reassemble the brokenness of something that is so part of your soul and nature as a woman, that's not an easy thing to do. It's not something that you can just unlearn. It leaves a wound on your soul that really needs to be healed by the Lord spiritually.
Hmm. And, when you were talking about some of these more masculine characteristics, well, we do know that there are some women who were bolder. I think of St. Catherine of Siena, I think of St. Joan of Arc. How do you reconcile that diversity in femininity, that you can be like Our Lady, where she was, there's a quiet strength, there's a maternal aspect, and then you have other women who were on the front lines, literally on the front lines, like Saint Joan of Arc. Can you talk about that diversity in femininity?
Absolutely. Well, one of the beauties of the healing and the understanding of my femininity and my maternal nature was that it's not a cookie cutter, one size fits all, right? Being feminine, there is this cultural misunderstanding in our society that to be feminine means certain shallow and superficial traits, right? Wearing pink frilly dresses and having painted nails and liking certain things that we see as superficially feminine. And that's something that doesn't go very far with who we are as women. Again, that's surface, and um it's not universal either, right? That's not what truly makes us feminine. And that's what I was not understanding either, is my femininity is deep rooted in who I am, in my nature. And it doesn't have to manifest in the same way that any other woman's femininity manifests. Really, how it manifests itself is in my ability to be maternal, right? So, of course, physically maternal, we give life as women, we harbor life, we nurture life from our own bodies. But yet, as we know through the writings of Edith Stein and John Paul II and many other beautiful theologians, that even if we never have kids biologically, if we are a consecrated or single, there is a spiritual motherhood that is there long before any physical motherhood would even take place. And that's something that never goes away either. And that makes us who we are as feminine creatures. And it's the same thing, the harboring life, the giving life, the nurturing life of others. Those same characteristics are deep embedded in our spirit as women. And so, what I needed to understand and connect with was who I truly am as a feminine creature, as, a daughter of God. And I can still be who I am. God made me who I am as a woman, to be bold, to be outspoken, to be very passionate. And I was under the false impression that to be a proper feminine woman meant that I had to be meek and mild and not outspoken, and really adopting to that 19th century understanding of how women were supposed to act in polite society, hold your tongue, don't have an opinion of your own. All of these things, again, that I had devoured in those 19th century writings and despised, that women, Jane Austen and all of these other writers, went against what these women were confined to have to be in society for a right reason, because that is not who we are as feminine. There are so many different attitudes and personalities and aspects of women as much as there are men. And that doesn't define us as being feminine or masculine. And so I had to come to a much deeper understanding of that. And as you said, there are saints, there's the Joan of Arcs and there's the Saint Therese's. But what I've come to understand is that God uses all of us in different ways. And even when we look at Joan of Arc, I don't think we can say, like, are you more like a Joan of Arc or more like a Saint Therese? Because in essence, they have more in common than they do apart from each other. And what I mean by that is, number one, it's this submission to God, right? In both cases, in all the powerful saints, we see first and foremost this desire to be in union with God, this absolute love of God, and this submission to God. So even when we think of Joan of Arc, a lot of times we almost see her secularly as doing this on her own. And if God's with her, great. And if he's not, that's fine too. Like, she's going to jump on that horse and grab the armor and take to the front lines. And, if God's helping her, then he's helping her. And if he's not, then, forget him. But that's not at all the story of Joan of Arc, right? It begins and ends with great submission to God. Even, again, it's so hard to look at Joan of Arc at the end when she was in jail and she was waiting and expecting some kind of freedom. And she really believed that there was going to come some kind of restoration and escape. And that never came in the way that she believed originally that it would come. But again, to the last moment, she had to submit to her freedom was through burning at the stake and going to heaven as a martyr. And again, when we look at Saint Therese, she had to basically surrender. You know, her desire was to be a missionary, to travel, to see the world. And her convent was super small. And she was confined even to her room for, the last year or two of her few years of her life because of her illness. So she had to submit in a different way than Joan. But both of them, it began and end with this great submission and surrender to God's will. And I think that is the difference, is that's where our strength comes from. And I did not see that or could not understand that on the other side of my faith.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully said. Would you say that your biological motherhood played a role in your conversion, or was it your conversion that happened that then helped you to shape your biological motherhood?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The Lord definitely used those together, but as I said, there had to be that healing aspect. I can't imagine if I would have become a biological mother before I really started to understand my femininity from the perspective of our faith, and to understand my maternity spiritually first, and to really dive into what it meant to be a woman and what it means to be spiritually maternal and life-giving, and to be able to accept all of those parts of myself and to see them as truly feminine in the way and unique in the way that God made me feminine. And so there were definitely years of healing that took place and years of embracing that and learning that. And then becoming a biological mother certainly brought it all to fruition. It's almost like going to heaven. It's like, okay, we learned all of this. We've studied all of this. We understand all of this. And then you're there, you're doing it, you're seeing it like, oh, okay, this is the beatific vision. Now I get it. For me, it was a fulfillment. Motherhood was really a fulfillment because I had come so full circle from seeing it in such a negative light, and then having that vision redeemed and seeing it in such a positive light, and then really longing for it in the depths of my soul for years before then actually meeting my husband and becoming a mother. It was, I think the Lord wanted this time for me to actually long for it, and not for it to just happen and, to be that easy, that there was this longing. And then when it came, to be able to see it was like a constant awakening to all the things that I had studied. So with my mind, all of a sudden my heart was being awakened to the many things that I had studied and learned in my intellect, but now I was understanding them on such a deeper level through my heart.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about how the influence of some of the books you were reading, and even philosophers like Aristotle, um, read incorrectly or read from one light can give you a negative view of womanhood and femininity. What parts of the church's teaching on sexuality or motherhood were especially hard to accept at first, and also what parts did you first misunderstand?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the hardest parts are definitely the understanding of, um, I guess, contraception and abortion and all of that. But I would say for me that was very early on, because when I actually entered into that conversion, I was like St. Paul, kind of all in. And although I maybe didn't understand certain things just because they hadn't been explained to me or taught to me, or I didn't have the wisdom to understand them, I think that when I truly converted, I had this humility that showed me that, okay, I don't understand this teaching, but I trust that the church is smarter than me. You know, all of these theologians from many, many centuries and all of these councils have a lot more wisdom than I do. So at this point, I just want to understand the truth. And even if it doesn't initially make sense, or I don't know why they're teaching certain things, I want to understand and I want to know this truth, and I believe that it is true. So for me, there weren't a lot of necessarily impediments. It was more the understanding of why the church taught certain things. And then once I understood that, there was so much beauty when I understood natural family planning as opposed to contraception, and what contraception truly was, and how it was limiting, really putting a barrier spiritually between the woman and the man and the act that, you know, that they were engaging in, that should be full and total and free and fruitful. So that marital act, I could see that it was limiting. That made so much sense to me. So really, I just needed to embrace the understanding of these things from a deeper theological perspective. And all of it made so much sense that I really had no trouble casting it off. I would say that it was funny because seeing it on the other from the other side, it makes sense that, you know, whenever I encountered people that were not well catechized and could not answer my questions, there was no reason for me to really search any deeper on those topics, because it seemed that they were limited and that there was nothing further to explore. So in essence, what I came to understand is how important it is to be a good apologist, even if you're not, you know, going for a degree or anything like that, but just in living your faith, in knowing your faith, so that you can be a light to other people. And when they do ask you questions, you're able to open that door to them that they desperately are knocking on. You're able to be that person that can open the door, even if it's just a little, to explain more. So for me, that was, I think, all of the things that I wanted to know initially the fastest. Was, you know, abortion kind of made initial sense to me. I never liked the idea of abortion in, you know, previously. Again, it was the last case scenario and a necessary evil. So it wasn't hard for me to understand why abortion would be wrong in all cases when you understand life. Contraception, of course, is a little bit harder to understand, but when you understand spiritually, how it disunifies and it undoes the fullness of the marital act and the openness towards God, that made sense to me. So I would definitely say the teaching of Humana Vitae on that was very important. And then again, I had fallen into a lot of these teachings on feminists such as Simone de Beauvoir, you know, 1949, The Second Sex, which is the feminist manifesto in a lot of cases, it's called. And there was this idea of creating your own identity, right? This existentialism that she promoted, this idea that marriage and motherhood threaten women's integrity, and that we have this enslavement to the generative function. So for me, it was undoing and understanding the truth that opposed all of those teachings. And it wasn't hard for me to embrace those because, again, as you so beautifully kept on alluding to, there was this negativity and this darkness and this sadness and this anger that accompanied those teachings. So it wasn't hard to let go of those things when truth is coupled with such freedom and joy and this absolute ability to continue and walk in the light that had not been there before. This open door that has no end, you know, the tunnel has no end to going deeper into the truth. So when you encounter that, it's not hard to embrace those truths and to continue walking in that light.
Beautifully said. And One a follow-up question, what surprised you the most about the church's teaching on femininity? And also if you can speak into St. John Paul II's feminine genius.
Absolutely. I think what surprised me, and it's a common erroneous thought of people outside the church, is that women are subjected in Catholicism, in Christianity, that women are the lesser, that women are not able to pursue these elevated positions, right? We look at it in a very secular way. So, in essence, I can't become a priest as a woman. I don't have this apostolic authority. So that's like the idea of not being able to become the CEO of this company, right? Like I could never become the CEO of the Catholic Church, or I can never be on the board of directors. So we have this erroneous way of putting it into secular language when we look at it. And then we see it as this um, way of keeping women out and this way of subjecting women, and we're not brought to the table. And that is just not true. And so I think one of the surprising things is that we can't relate the theological to the secular in the same way. It's not an apples and oranges kind of thing that we can juggle. It's entirely different. And the spiritual is, I would say, the starting point necessary in order to inspire and influence and understand every other walk of life and to be able to structure society in an appropriate manner. We need to first understand all of these spiritual layers. And so, as you were talking about with John Paul II, and he really brought to light this idea of the feminine genius, he did so much and made so many strides on allowing women to understand their elevated position in the church. And again, when we look to the Blessed Mother as this model, this elevated model of womanhood, of femininity, of maternity, we really don't have to go too far to see where we are and where we stand in the eyes of God and in the eyes of the church. And all of that makes sense. The roles of women and men in the church all begin to make sense. And John Paul II said in his letter to women, which was 1995, the secret of making speedy progress in achieving full respect for women and their identity begins with a universal recognition of the dignity of women. And again, this is where it all comes from. It's not who has what position or who has more power or who's allowed to do more with what. This really comes down to our dignity. And so understanding our dignity and our worth and our value, and really all of that, as John Paul II taught us, is rooted in our identity as daughters of God. And if you can't understand that, then you are just going to be fighting for superficial aspects of, a piece of the pie or a better seat at the table or a more elevated position. So he really showed that women possess these certain elements of our femininity that are so powerful. For instance, receptivity, right? We look at that as something that is negative, something that is passive, but receptivity from the eyes of spiritual truth is really so deeply powerful. It's the ability to cooperate with God in a yes to something that He's asking us. And whenever God is asking us to do something, it is going to bring us spiritually to the fullness of who we were created as a human person. And some of those missions are great, as we talked about with Joan of Arc, and some of those missions don't seem so great when we think about Saint Therese remaining in a small convent and then dying of tuberculosis at a young age and writing one book, right? But that book would become so transformative and powerful for so many people in the church. So again, it's our ability to cooperate with God, to put ourselves aside, our spiritual pride aside, and to give our yes in receptivity to God. And so what John Paul II spoke about, where there's these certain qualities of the feminine soul. And not to say, again, that the masculine soul does not possess things such as receptivity. The church is feminine, the church is receptive, so we are all receptive as the church. But in a very particular way, women embrace these qualities, which allow us to cooperate with God in a way that is different from men, in a way that's different from masculinity. And when John Paul II brought those to light, it allowed women to see their dignity, their value, and their worth in a way that I think previously had not been brought to the fullness of our understanding and our attention. So it was imperative during the papacy of John Paul II to focus on that. And he really did. He was very receptive to the Holy Spirit in understanding that the church needed to be taught those lessons on the feminine genius, the dignity of women. Both men and women needed to understand, in order to make progress and to move ahead as a church, we needed to understand the dignity that we hold as women, and in essence, the influence that we have in the church and in society. It's an influence that's different than what we're looking for secularly, but it's a bigger and an eternal influence.
Right. Of course, I think that the message that we need to get across is that we are equal in dignity, but the expression of what that looks like in a masculine form versus a feminine form is different. And even with your example of Saint Therese, she was elevated to become a doctor of the church, right? And so God takes our receptivity, our cooperation with Him, and if we do our part in cooperating with Him, let Him do the work of elevating whatever it is that he wants through us and through our cooperation. So beautifully said. I think one question, especially as it relates to the church, there's some debate, especially now, about whether or not feminism is compatible with Christianity. What's your answer to that?
Yes, that is definitely something that has become a conflated topic lately. And this is something that's not new to the writing of my book or to, answers that I've given. And for me, I would say the short answer is no, it is not compatible with Christianity. And when I say that, I understand that there are a lot of Catholic theologians, scholars, or women in any aspect of life that do consider themselves Catholic or Christian feminists. And again, I will start by saying that you need a caveat to say that. You need to say, I am a Catholic feminist. I am a Christian feminist. I am a pro-life feminist. And you can't say that apart. You can't just say feminist apart from an explanation. And I think that is for good reason. And the reason is, the term feminist was not really coined until the turn of the century. Until the 20th century, we didn't start using the term feminist. And we have to look at the genesis of the term. That term was highly influenced by feminists such as Simone de Beauvoir, who I mentioned before, who was one of the brains of coining a term in the first place. And again, this came from her existentialist belief that we create our own identity. She said that women are female insofar as they feel themselves as such. So she's coming from this understanding in 1949, right? And before that, we had Margaret Sanger, who was a big influence as well on these terms. And so we look at the second industrial revolution, the late 19th century, the early 20th century, things that were happening socially. We look at some of these philosophers and social influencers that were changing the language of the women's movement previously in the 19th century. And suddenly we see a coining of the term feminism. And so what did that embrace? And there were certain certain structures to feminism that were embraced at the time. And we look at these sometimes erroneously as coming later, say the 60s and 70s, the sexual revolution, when these things were added on. And that's not correct. The systematic beliefs were that abortion should be normalized. Gender is an idea, right? The family structure is fluid. There's no concrete reality of masculinity and femininity, and fertility is utilitarian rather than gift. So these are the systematic beliefs that are essentially associated with feminism as an ideology. And again, we're looking at this even in the early 20th century. We're looking at these ideas. And so we cannot say that these are things that were added on later. So what I like to say is when I'm talking about some of the early women's rights activists, when I look at the 19th century, I really call those women, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Tennessee Claflin, Eliza Bisbee Duffy, so many others. These women, I call them women's rights activists because that's what they were. They were essentially for the rights of women in society that were not being given to women at the time. So these property, education, marital rights, votes, career opportunities, those were the rights that they were fighting for, which were not available to women in society. They were very much fighting for women on the platform of their motherhood, of their ability to raise their children well in a society, of their ability to be protected if there should be a separation or divorce or something that happened to their husband or their property, so that women would be able to be guarded in their motherhood and be protected in raising their children well and being able to have a voice in society to make decisions. For instance, to send their sons to war because their sons would be the ones that would be fighting in a war, to be able to make decisions for their daughters, to be able to have education so that they could be companions to husbands or, greater equals to others in society, be they men or women, or to have opportunities to have a career or run a business or inherit the family estate or property or business or any of those things. So women in the 19th century were by and large looking out for their vocation as mothers. And you see a radical shift when the term feminism comes into play, that it's no longer necessarily about those rights. It's about equality in society. And again, the only way that equality in society is going to happen is if we start taking a closer look at things such as this access to reproductive health. We start looking at this access to changes in what the definition of family is. And we start becoming dedicated to women's equality through these policies and these advocacies.
To your point, so some people like Erica Bakayaki, we had her on the show to talk about her book as well, believe that the early feminists, they were feminists, but that's the first wave feminists versus second or third wave feminists, that the early feminists were Christian, pro-life, and that as time passed, women lost sight of that and then added all these other things that were not part of the original feminist ideas. So that abortion and all those other things that you mentioned came later on. And then of course there's others who believe that feminism as a term and even as an idea was never Christian. Where do you fall in that? Obviously you talked about feminism, and you differentiated by using a different term, right? Women's rights activists. Could you just talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. I think that is an essential question. And that is why it's so important to understand the history of the lives of these women and not just necessarily what they said and wrote, which is important and it's what we have, but also what influenced them, right? So we're talking about Christianity, for instance, in their personal lives. So a lot of these early women's rights activists in the 19th century were Quakers. They were influenced by Quakerism. There was different forms of Christianity with some of them. A lot of it was a loose, what we would consider evangelical or something along those lines. We know Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, strongly influenced by their Quaker backgrounds. Elizabeth Cady Stanton did start as like a non-denominational Christian, but as she went along through her activism, she actually lost her faith. And we know that in 1895, she wrote the Women's Bible, which was a revision of the Bible, Old and New Testament, focusing on the status of women, particularly coming up with the conclusion and the thesis that all religion teaches women's inferiority and subjection, and that we need to keep the women's movement secular. That was what came out of the Women's Bible. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton said that maternity for the rest of womankind is referred to as weakness, disability, curse, and evidence of woman's divinely ordained subjection. That was particularly her response to Catholicism. She was talking about the Blessed Mother, how we as a church elevate the Blessed Mother in her maternity, but for the rest of womankind, we see it as a weakness and a disability and a curse. She said that is what the Catholic Church teaches us about motherhood. And so she was very anti-Catholicism in the teaching of the Catholic Church and really the Bible and all Christianity in general. By 1895, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was very much against Christianity and the teaching of Christianity towards women. So I think what you will see with a lot of these women, if you follow them throughout the 19th century, is as they became more deeply involved with the women's movement, unfortunately, their Christianity and their faith faded. We see that again with certain people like Tennessee Claflin, whose voice was so influential against abortion. A lot of these women in the 19th century were anti-abortion, which is, of course, a very strong Christian platform. And so in that case, yes, in the 19th century, the women's rights activists were by and large pro-life. You can say that across the board, regardless of their influence in faith. They saw abortion as an evil, as just a human evil. It didn't matter if we were talking about faith or secular terms here. This was just a great evil. And, Tennessee Claflin said abortion is only a symptom of a more deep-seated disorder of the social state. So it cannot be put down by law. So she was seeing as something deeper that needed to be attacked. But that's the point that I want to make, Irina, is that we cannot look at these women from the 19th century and see this clear and pure Christianity influencing the women's rights activist movement. And then all of a sudden in the 20th century, seeing that it flipped to some kind of secular existentialism, that is simply not true. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is one of the loudest voices from the 19th century, and she did a lot of damage in the front of pulling women away from Christianity through her influence in the women's movement. And that's not to negate what she did for women's rights, which I respect and am thankful for. But I think we need to differentiate between these women and what they did for us in society in winning the right to vote and in winning these certain rights for us and these vindications for us. And yet we can't look at them as the pillars of faith. We cannot model our faith off of these women's rights activists. This is not where you want to go to model your faith. And so I think that it is abundantly necessary to study what influenced them and how their faith declined. And that's something that we are not talking about. Feminists and women's rights activists and theologians, we're just not talking about that. We're looking at what these women did. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a mother of many children, and she was very dedicated mother to her family and a good mother to her family. And yet her beliefs, her faith crumbled. And that women's Bible influenced a lot of people erroneously and brought a lot of women away from Christianity and away from scripture because they had so much respect for her and because of her platform and her position. So again, I sound like I'm speaking very negatively towards those 19th century women's rights activists. And in the sense of speaking from a theological perspective, I am. But that is not to say that I don't have immense respect for what they did. And so that is the separation. And that's why I'm saying that it's not compatible with Christianity. It's a different thing. Feminism, if you want to look at, again, feminism is an ideology that started in the 20th century. If you want to call these women early feminists, that's, fine, I guess, in a certain way. There's a different wave, you can say. Again, they're in a different wave of feminism. You can start separating the waves of feminism. But if you want to say that they were Christian influencers, then I would say they were very negative, destructive Christian influencers in a lot of ways. And again, not all of them, but some of the most well-known and loudest voices would be seen as not being pillars of the faith or women to be emulated when we look at faith. So hopefully that clarifies why I believe that Christianity is not compatible with feminism. Christianity is a different thing. It's like saying you have some kind of party. Again, people want to say I'm Republican or I'm Democrat, and you can't be this or that, or you can't be a certain party or ideology if you're not faithful, or if your faith can't dictate these things. And that is a different conversation politically. Like, can we be a political party and be associated with a certain faith or certain values in our faith? And that's almost the way that I look at feminism. What these women were doing was activating for women's rights. And the abortion issue in the 19th century was not necessarily influenced by faith at all. They more saw it through reason, through the eyes of reason. They didn't even have the same science and technology and understanding scientifically that we have. But it was almost from this innocence of a child that you just see that this is wrong, and what it's doing to society and women in society, unmarried women who are having children in society, who are having abortions. What it's doing is wrong. And so based on our evidence of abortion and our understanding of abortion, this is wrong. Now, if you had taken those same women from the 19th century and put them into the 20th century with new technology, new understanding, new influence, maybe they would have embraced abortion. I don't know, because it certainly wasn't their faith that was keeping them from these truths.
And so, going off of this point, is there a way to take the good parts of feminism, which is women's rights to vote, for property, for that kind of those kinds of equal footing with men, and kind of discard the parts of feminism that modern feminism have taken on, the abortion, contraception, pushing for all those things, even confusing what the family structure is, or all of that? Is there a way to do that? And you had mentioned earlier that you kind of have to say, I'm a Catholic feminist or a Christian feminist. Would that be the way to do it? To say, well, I'm caveating my feminism based on my faith values, which come first.
Well, the way that I like to describe myself is an advocate for the dignity of women. And I don't use the term feminism. I don't want to add a caveat. I don't want to be confused into saying I'm a pro-life feminist or I'm a feminist, but I don't believe that, gender is fluid, and I don't believe that reproductive rights should include abortion and contraception on demand. And I don't believe, that we can change who we are biologically. And I don't want to have to enter into all the things that feminism has embraced and been associated with. And, there are some people that do want to almost redeem feminism or to take back the original notion of feminism. Again, as I pointed out before, there is not really any fullness of what feminism ever was, except for some of these destructive terms from even the 19th century. Again, if we want to take feminism to just be a 19th century understanding of rights for women and pro-life, that could be one way of doing it and taking the faith entirely out of it. But a lot of those rights have been won. For instance, we do have the right to vote. We do have the marital rights, the property rights, the inheritance rights. As far as the United States, women in the United States, we have been victorious. They've been victorious. The 19th century, everything that they fought for is now in place. So that chapter, in a sense, is closed. And we need to move forward into what do we fight for next? Like, what are we being called to as a society? And as we visited before Arena John Paul II, is that fighting for the dignity of every human person. And women, men, the child in the womb, all of those things are necessary because we can't go back to the 19th century and we don't need to. We need to move forward to the challenges that we have now. So I say that I am an advocate for the dignity of women because I believe that that is, as a Catholic woman, as a Catholic theologian, as a Catholic writer, that is what I'm called to do moving forward. That's what we are all called to do, is advocate for the dignity. And what our culture needs the most is a response to their understanding of who they are as a human person, who they are as women and men, what the family is, and how essential the family structure is to our social building. So all of those things are necessary responses. And what we should be focusing on is explaining and apologizing on the dignity of the human person and the dignity of human life. So we absolutely have a debt of gratitude owed to all of the women who have walked before. For better or worse, they've brought good and bad to the table. But the rights that we have as women in this country, of course, are owed to many women who came before us. And the right to vote and the right to have, equal pay and job. And not only that, but even other things that have helped with, the female worker and the mother, for instance, in the 21st century. It's really the 21st century brought in this equality of the female worker and the mother. And there were things that were put in place as early as, 1979. We had the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, where a woman couldn't be fired for being pregnant, right? And so even into the 70s, the late 70s, we still had women who could not work and be pregnant without fear of getting fired, without fear of not being able to provide if they were alone with that child and not married. So there have been many things that have been put in place throughout the 19th century, the 20th century, the 21st century. And we owe a debt of gratitude to all of the women who have helped to forge forward to make this country better and more equal for women in all walks of life. But we can't lose sight now of the fact that all of those efforts should be for our dignity, for our protection. I think if there's one thing that we take from those early women's rights activists from the 19th century, it's that what are we fighting for? They were fighting for women to be protected as mothers whose husbands were drunks, they were alcoholics. They were blowing through the family money. They weren't coming home. They weren't working. Women couldn't support their children. They had no way of getting an education, a career. And the women who were single, the women who got pregnant out of wedlock, the women who were dying in poorhouses, the women who had to go to people like Madame Restel and get abortions from people who weren't doctors, and so again, all of these things that were happening in the 19th century that women had no ability to change socially, these were the things that they were fighting for, in essence, to restore women's dignity and to protect them as mothers and as wives, as single women, as women in society, that they could be protected. And I think if we lose sight of that, then we can go forward infinitely in fighting for more and more rights, but they're going to start becoming transmuted, like the right to change our bodies, right? That's where we are now. What are the rights that we are fighting for? We're fighting for the right to compete in sports that are not the biological sport of our sex. We're fighting for the rights of children as young as, maybe kindergarten, to be able to start talking about physical and chemical changes to their sex of origin. We're fighting for rights for people to recognize our gender as our identity. When you look at where we're going, if it's not influenced by our dignity, then we can continue fighting infinitely for rights for women and men, but they're going to go into this, again, transmuted and destructive path.
Sure. And of course, obviously, with abortion, that is not in line with our dignity, not only our dignity as mothers and as women, but also protecting the dignity of the preborn child. And there is a separation between the early feminists who, as you said, were across the board pro life, and then the later feminists who basically pushed for abortion. And so, in that vein, how did the modern feminists, the later feminists, deconstruct motherhood and kind of tear apart at the fabric of actually what it means to be a woman? In many ways, they actually undid a lot of what the early ones were doing. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Absolutely. Well, I like to look at it starting with Margaret Sanger, because she started really with her 1914 Women Rebel, which she released. Margaret Sanger was a socialist, eugenicist, birth control advocate. She started the first clinic in the early 20th century. She started a human research clinic. So all of this was very early in the 20th century. When we talk about that turn from the 19th century women's rights advocates to the 20th century feminists, we see Margaret Sanger kind of at the forefront and the beginning of that conversation in the early, teens of the 20th century. So if we look at Margaret Sanger, and one of the quotes that she said is, "My private and personal conception of what feminism should mean, that is, women should first free themselves from biological slavery, which could best be accomplished through birth control." So that's an early quote of Margaret Sanger about what feminism should mean. Again, we're talking about these early voices in the 20th century. Margaret Sanger is one of the biggest and loudest, in my opinion, of the feminist contribution to the 20th century. And there she is, quote unquote, using the term feminism to define what feminism should mean in our society. So she's giving voice to what feminism should mean. And for her, it's women's first freedom should be freeing themselves from their biological slavery through birth control. So there's our first brick in the feminist wall of the 20th century, is let's free ourselves from biological slavery. And I think the 20th century followed suit with that. As we know, Margaret Sanger did find that answer to birth control for American women. And she did start clinics all over the country, Planned Parenthood, for women to be able to receive that birth control, which would later be added on as abortion, Plan B, you name it now, through any number of different forms of sterilizations that have come through that channel that she started in the early 20th century. And then, as I also mentioned several times, Simone de Beauvoir, who is really the philosophical genius, if you will, of the formulation of feminism in the 20th century. And she was really beginning not only wholeheartedly behind abortion and against the Catholic Church in particular, and she really blamed Christianity and Catholicism for abortion being seen in our society as an evil and a wrong. She believed that it was because of the efforts of the Catholic Church to oppose abortion that Americans couldn't simply digest or accept it in the same way that her home country of France could accept contraceptives and abortions. We had this moral opposition that she didn't see existing in her country. And she believed that the Catholic Church was largely to blame for that, which as Catholics, we see that as a good thing. But again, she also believed that women were enslaved to their generative function. We see this over and over again as we have this enslavement as women. We have, as Margaret Sanger said, a biological slavery. And we have got to learn how to free ourselves from this. And this became the mission of feminism in the 20th century. And again, we see that through many feminists that would follow in the 60s and 70s. We see that with Betty Friedan, you know, she's writing her 1963, The Feminine Mystique, which is the housewives' feminism. So that's when it kind of came from being less radical. Before, in the early 20th century, I think a lot of these ideas were seen as more radical. And then all of a sudden, Betty Friedan was able to make them become a theology that every housewife could accept. It became so fundamental almost to how we would go forward as women in society, that we needed to control our fertility. That became number one. And again, Betty Friedan would go on in 1966 to found now the National Organization of Women. So these were some of the building blocks of the early 20th century. And I would say the focus. So when you ask on how we tore apart the dignity of women, primarily it was through not only coming up with ways to solve, quote unquote, the problem, but it was in naming the problem itself and in erroneously seeing the problem as biological slavery, this gift of fertility given to women, this inability to understand who we are fundamentally as women, our maternal nature as women, how this influences everything that we are to contribute to the world. Instead, seeing all of our contributions, our feminine genius, if you will, to see all of those as inhibiting our furthering in society, and having the entire country believe that there is a problem with women that needs to be solved, and the problem is our biological slavery. And, you know, our generative function is the problem. So that is fundamentally what went wrong. And the reverberations from that are going to be felt for who knows how long. That influenced everything. It was that false understanding. And as you said, it turned against who we were previously in the 19th century. What those women were fighting to protect was now what they were fighting to destroy. That we don't have to be mothers, that we don't have to accept who we are as created by God, because maybe, first of all, there is no God, or maybe if there is a God, he made a mistake, or maybe we need to help society to right the wrongs that have been put in place through scripture or through man's understanding of God's place for us. We need to rewrite all those things. Women kind of need to step in. We need to cancel out our reproductive function so that we can get into the game and teach these men what the truth of society and scripture really is. We need to kind of rewrite the past and rewrite God's word, in essence.
Right. And what many people don't know is that at the beginning, when the birth control pill was being developed by Margaret Sanger and others, it was very unethical. Women were given different doses, etc., and they were dying. So in the development
Mhm.
of the birth control pill, you had women dying because of the types of experiments that were done on them. But how did contraception reshape not just behavior of not only women, but also men, but also how did it reshape their identity?
Yeah, that is something that we are pondering long into the future. And again, Pope Paul VI in Humanae Vitae really had a prophetic understanding of what this would do, what contraception would do. This was in 1968. He was really foretelling how this would reshape the relationship of women and men in society and in humanity in relating to one another. And that really came to fruition. As you said, Planned Parenthood in the early stages in 1956, they had their first large scale human trial of birth control in Puerto Rico. It was undisclosed what they were doing, so it was very unethical. The women did not know what they were signing up for or that they were really being experimented on. It was very experimental. The hormone levels were 20 times too high in that particular experiment in Puerto Rico, and many women died initially or thereafter because of those extremely high levels of the hormone that they were exposed to. As well, 25% of women living on reservations began to be sterilized throughout the 1970s. And there was this move in eugenics. People with disabilities began to be sterilized against their will. So, again, with Margaret Sanger and that eugenics movement that started to take hold through the 20th century, I believe that that went hand in hand with this understanding that human life can be controlled, that our fertility can be controlled, and a loss of the nature of it, right? So there is a nature, a natural order to our fertility. It's given by God as gift. That's the first misunderstanding. We have to start there. This is given as gift. And as it's gifted to us, there is a natural order to it, as with all things that God has created. And all natural orders are good. So with our fertility, there's purpose, and it goes beyond the generative purpose of having children, which is the first good, but it's also the union of husband and wife, which is essential element, that open, total free, the trusting in God that comes with that openness, the trusting of the other, the openness to the other. All of these are spiritual reflections of not only who we are as women and men, but how we relate to one another. And we want to compartmentalize these, right? We want to compartmentalize the generative function. We want to make it very utilitarian. And we want to separate all of these things into neat little boxes that in no way interact with the other. And that's not who we are. Again, it's comical to me because as a society, we want to tout wholeness, right? Everything is like holistic, and we need holistic diet and holistic health and holistic medicine. And we just want to be holistic all together. We don't want to leave anything out. But yet we are very divided when it comes to who we are as human beings, right? I mean, the generative function, oh no, that needs to be controlled by this pill and kind of separated on the side. Our relationship as women and men is going to go over in this other category. The family, well, to each his own. Every family is going to run itself its own way. It's very fluid. We don't even know what a family is anymore, or what it comprised of, or what its foundation is, or how essential it is to society. So we have compartmentalized these things so much that we no longer understand them. And that was something that Pope Paul VI did prophesy. Like we said, he saw this coming, that we would use each other, that women and men would use each other, that this would become utilitarian, because when you enter in contraceptive, reproductive fallbacks such as abortion, Plan B, sterilization, you're able to use the other person without any consequence, you could say, but without, again, seeing the gift of what could come from this interaction. You're seeing this as just interaction that's happening, an exchange that's happening between two people for pleasure, and we don't have to worry about any consequences, i.e., a child, right? A gift, a human person, an eternal soul. We're changing the language, we're changing our understanding, and we think that with that, we can change the reality, the nature, and the fundamental truth of what is happening. And that is erroneous, and it is a fallacy, and it is a heresy, and we're deep into it. And so that is, where we are now and how we are trying to oppose the damage that's been done. And I would say what needs to be done is really what you're doing, Arena, and what I'm doing and what many people are doing is to explain to people, to educate people, and to really go back to just the fundamental truth that most people were able to grasp before so much confusion was brought into the language and the conversation of who we are as women and men, and of our reproductive qualities and of our spiritual and physical qualities, is that, women and men are both created in the image of God, two different modes of being, two different reflections of the nature of God, equal, as you said, and both beautifully different in so many ways. We all reflect God. And then there's individually, right? Every single individual reflects God in then again, another unique way, which is unrepeatable. And so I think first we need to go back to the kindergarten theology 101 fundamentals of who we are. And then I think for women, our most primary message needs to be that our fertility is not a curse, but a gift. And that we are loved, and that it comes from love, and that there's such a beauty in the feminine and who we are as women that needs to be restored. Because in society, there is a prevailing lie that we are unloved by God, we are unloved by society, we are unloved by the family, we are unloved by other women in society, that it has to be this fight, this clawing to the death, climbing to the top. And there needs to be a restoration of who we are, first of all, so that we can enter into marriage, so that we can enter into a family, so that we can enter into the world with a proper understanding of the human person and who we are as women.
So powerfully said. And I think that what one of the takeaways is how this whole idea that's shattered human dignity, it was a domino effect. It was contraception led to abortion and no fault divorce, to a complete misunderstanding of both the male and female bodies, to the point where we are today, where we have gender ideology and confusion, complete breakdown of the family. So many things, I believe, have happened as a result of these bad ideas of feminism, that we have to somehow be separated from our fertility, that somehow our fertility, our healthy, functioning fertility, is somehow bad or wrong. Your book title, Motherhood Redeemed, says a lot about where you want to take this. First of all, how can motherhood be redeemed at this point, given where we're at, culturally speaking? And how do you challenge the idea that motherhood is an obstacle to success?
Those are great questions. And I will just point out from what you just said, one more point about the 19th century disparity on feminism and trying to purify that. In 1861, the National Women's Rights Convention, which we often hark back to so often, one of the main conversations there was the reconstruction of the marriage system. And there, especially again, going back to voices such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, there was a strong effort for no-fault divorce, even in the 19th century among these early women's rights activists. So I will even point out that that was another difference in what Christianity would hold to be true and what these early women's rights activists held to be true. And again, Tennessee Claflin, 1871, pro-life activist in the 19th century, very much believed in free love and multiple partners and things like that. A lot of these women, again, pro-life activists of the 19th century, were fighting for an alteration on Christian marriage. So, sorry, but I had to add that because, again, there's so many people that are trying to purify the women's rights movement of the 19th century and kind of put this white baptismal cloth over it to make it pair so well with Christianity. And I just think it's really important to show that it doesn't. But in answer to your question, yes, Motherhood Redeemed, the reason that I went with that title, Motherhood Redeemed, is because for me, especially through my experience personally, and then what I've seen working with women and studying and through scholarship of these topics and studying women's rights activism throughout the centuries, one of the things that I've come to understand as the most harmful element in the structure of women gaining rights and women pursuing freedoms in society is that we have pit ourselves against our nature as maternal. And again, that could be physical, but it's essentially spiritual. And that's where I want to look at it because as we've said so much before with trying to free ourselves from this slavery to our basically ability to have children, to our maternal nature biologically, by separating ourselves from that, we have done a lot of damage in society. You know, the birth rate is dropping in this country and many other countries. So we see social damage there. A lot of children are the casualty of women that have focused for so many generations on their own career and putting their families last and putting their children last. There's so many latchkey kids that felt alone, unloved. Who knows? Maybe they were left alone for many hours of the day, and then their parents were present physically, but not emotionally, not spiritually. So we have a lot of adults now, and for the past few generations, that have felt increasingly less connected to a family of origin and less equipped to then enter into their own family and create their own family. And there's a lot of division between families of origin, between communities. There's a lot of lack of community or being able to form community because people simply don't have the skills, the experience, or the knowledge and understanding, or the resilience, really. You know, we see in this cancel culture when something's said that you don't like, when there's an opinion that differs from yours, it's just to cancel the other person, to walk away, to break the community, to break the vow. And so there needs to be a restoration of that. So with motherhood, it's to understand spiritually again, to redeem that understanding that motherhood is a powerful, beautiful, and God-given word, you know, to speak of language. We have that word of maternal, motherhood, feminine, all of these, the language needs to be restored. And then also deeper than that, the understanding of the power that we have. And I don't mean power in the secular way, but in the way that John Paul II spoke in the feminine genius. We have this ability, this great ability as women to bring our gifts to any walk of life. You know, Edith Stein spoke about bringing these feminine qualities everywhere, to bring them into the workplace, to bring them into the family, to bring them into education systems. So, with bringing these feminine qualities into the world, we redeem motherhood. We show women that motherhood is a good and powerful and life-changing, culturally changing element. And I think that there is a turn, Arena. I do think there is a turn because women and men are sick of all of these lies. They're sick of opposing their nature. You know, that will naturally happen. God has made us naturally to embrace and seek freedom. And when we are opposing that freedom for so long, it is exhausting. It is, as you said earlier, restless. It makes us restless. It makes us angry. And that begins happening as a culture. We begin to die spiritually, physically, culturally, we begin to die. And I think right now, a lot of people are experiencing the slow death of our culture, the slow death of their souls, in essence. I mean, sadly. And people are either going, down the drain with it, or there's a movement of people that are beginning to wake up and say, there's got to be something more, which is what I said. And if I was created by a God, and if this God is love, then he must love me individually, and he also must love what he chose to create me, which was woman. And then if he did love what woman is, then there must be some beautiful redemptive quality of what woman is. And that's the beginning of many chapters of the power of our maternal love.
And again, beautifully said. Obviously, a lot of women have become the victims of what the cultural understanding of femininity, of motherhood is. So, how can a woman reclaim her identity if she feels disconnected from her maternal vocation? And when I speak about maternal vocation, again, I want to identify it as either spiritual or physical. It could be both, but some women may never get married. There's still a call to a maternal vocation. So if a woman feels disconnected from her maternal vocation or broken by her past, what is her way forward?
Yes, that is a pretty deep question because there are, again, so many layers to that. And I think, again, it's not a one size fits all or a snap your fingers. We are body and soul, right? We have mind, will, intellect. And so when there's a wound that happens, it affects all of those aspects of our human person. It's not something where we can just pick up a book and read, one-on-one of what it is to be a woman. And then, okay, I got it. I'm going to go forward from here. A lot of times these wounds do come with a lot of baggage. There's a lot of past healing that needs to be revisited and a lot of restoration that needs to take place. And so, again, that begins with the Lord. That healing begins in our spirit. And as women and as maternal, one of the beautiful things about us is that we want to be restored. We want to be renewed. We want to recommune with people. We want healing. We seek that. The maternal seeks that in a way that I think is more ambitious than the masculine. And so the beauty of that is that first of all, we do need to have a proper understanding of all of these things as we've outlined, a proper understanding of who we are before the Lord, a proper understanding of who we are as women, of the nature of maternity, of our maternal call. And like you said, this is something that I'm primarily talking about spiritually, because you can be a physical mother and not understand your spiritual motherhood at all. And that can really be destructive to the child that you bear, or to the world around you, or to the family around you, or to society around you. If you don't understand your spiritual maternity, you can really do damage. And again, you're acting against your nature. So you're doing damage to your own soul. So first, it's understanding these truths as best you can. And then it's seeking healing. If there are real wounds that happened, say, in your family or in your past, or with certain abuses, either brought on by others or brought on by yourself, by putting yourself in certain situations, I think it's revisiting these both spiritually and emotionally, through counseling, through spiritual direction, through all of these things, because we are, again, comprehensive beings. We are body and soul. We are mind. We are spirit. We are intellect, will. And so we need to really allow the healing to penetrate all these areas of our life. And that could include counseling, that could include spiritual direction, that could include just a lot of time in silence and asking a reordering and a renewal of the mind and the soul. And then it's going to be restructuring language and the brain's natural tendency to go down paths that it's been used to going down. So again, it's surrounding yourself with a community of people or a community of voices that's going to help to re-engage those truthful statements so that you can begin to allow yourself to believe and also speak them regularly. And I think that is a way for women to begin with a restoration. And it really is that recognition and that rejection, a constant rejection of the antagonizing voices in society that perpetuate those lies.
Right. And what would you say to a woman who is afraid of embracing her femininity, afraid of becoming a mother, either spiritually or physically, and who basically has bought into the lie that motherhood is somehow burdensome?
Right. Well, I think it again comes in the same form that it came to me, which is you are so loved. I think that needs to be the first message to sit with before anything else. And it can be so daunting to look at, so far down the future road of these things, to try to digest all the truths and to see suddenly maternity as gift can seem very daunting to someone who had a very closed perspective of self, and in turning in on self and worrying only about themselves. And then to see maternity and the maternal spirit is a mirror that's turned away from the self. It's arms that are wide open rather than closed, and it's eyes looking out instead of in. And I think that is very daunting at first. It's a complete shift. If you had been embracing the opposing view on that before, and the structure set up for women to become powerful aggressors in society, and as I had previously said, embracing these masculine attributes in society, if you had believed those to be the mantra or the virtues of your former life, then I think it needs to begin with an understanding primarily that you are loved for simply who you are, and to be able to see the maternal as a renewal of your life in something that is going to bring so much fruit and joy and life, and that there is this ability, as I spoke about in my conversion, I felt that these walls that I had built up around my heart were crumbling. And it's so abrasive to have to keep those walls built at all times. And there's such a freedom in being able to allow those walls to fall and allow your heart, which is now maybe more unprotected and more vulnerable. But that is the maternal heart, right? To be able to allow that to be exposed takes a great deal of vulnerability. And I think that is where some of the healing initially takes place, because I think there's this inability to be vulnerable and to allow your heart to be exposed. And it takes immense strength and courage to allow that maternal heart and that vulnerability to be encountering others and to be encountered by others. And to be able to face past hurts and to be able to heal rifts in family of origins, if it's possible, to be able to forgive wrongs that have been done of people throughout your past, if that's possible, to be able to revisit instances where those lies were spoken into your life and to be able to speak truth into those moments. All of that takes time, effort, courage, vulnerability, strength. I mean, these are all the attributes of the feminine soul, and we all have them in abundance. And so I think it's taking back and reclaiming and redeeming the strengths that we truly have as women, and not trying to reinvent them or repackage them or fight for something that is opposed to our nature when we have such power and gift in our own nature.
Beautiful. And what about those women who are deeply yearning? They've done their healing and they're deeply yearning for that biological motherhood, and yet their spouses haven't come along. What's your message to them?
Well, this is something that you and I can both speak to, Arena, because both of us got married later than maybe we would have liked to, or um, maybe the cultural norm of some of our friends and family. I know for me, as I spoke about before, I really had to go through that healing, which I did, go through that recognition of my call, which I did, because at one point in time, I thought maybe I am called to be single. Maybe I am called to the religious life. And then understanding that I am called to marriage and family life, biological motherhood, if God's willing, being able to give my yes to that years before God then actually produced the man to fulfill that role. I think that we can speak into this. Those years after discovering and accepting and longing for that, and then having to wait out that time, was difficult and was a spiritual challenge for me, at least. The wondering if God would fulfill that and how he would fulfill that desire of my heart. I kept on trusting that he would either fulfill the desire for that on my heart, or that he would take it away and replace it with something new. That kept on being my prayer, that, Lord, this seems to be the desire that's burning in me. You've brought me through so many courses of change, renewal, healing, redemption, with all of this maternal understanding and these truths of femininity. And we've walked through so many avenues of discernment. And here is where you have led my heart firmly and solidly. And so, if this desire, which seems to be burning in my heart and in my soul, if this is truly what you're calling me to, then I know that you will answer this call. And if it's not, if there's just a purpose for you wanting me to see the gift and the joy and the elevation of marriage for some purpose that's further along my formation and my spiritual journey, then, point taken. So please remove the fire. If this is not the way that you seek to fulfill it, then please give me that desire elsewhere in a way that you can fulfill or that you plan to fulfill. And funny story for me and my husband is a convert from agnosticism. He actually was raised with no faith, and he went to a secular university, and he wound up finding his faith in the Catholic Church at a secular university his senior year of college. And so when I was at that point of ready to find and accept my spouse, he was not really there yet. Like, he was just a baby in his faith journey, and he was still really trying to figure out where he was and how he fit in and what that faith meant. And he really longed to have a more solid understanding and a better education in his faith. And I, at the time, had really longed for a man who was very grounded and solid in his faith. So had the Lord introduced me to him at that time, it never would have worked. I really don't think that I would have given him a second glance, or we would have been compatible enough. And I wound up starting to pray a rosary every day for my future spouse during that time. And it was about 5 years of period of time. And during those 5 years, he actually prayed that he would have some special graces to help him enter deeper into the faith life that he was longing for. So it's so funny. I remember that when we did meet and when we did speak and start to get to know each other, we exchanged those stories, and we had this epiphany moment where we realized that at the same exact time I had dedicated to start praying a rosary every day for my future spouse, he had begged the Lord for special graces from who knows where, because again, he didn't have a family that was practicing, and he didn't have a community of friends at the time, or he was just completely a lone wolf and didn't have anyone to really ask to pray specifically for him. So he was just kind of begging God to send these graces, supernatural graces for him particularly. So that to me is mind blowing, to think that for 5 years I was praying a rosary for him every day. And during those 5 years, he was asking for these special graces to be sent from someone somewhere to him.
That's so powerful. It actually gave me chills. And again, God prepares our hearts and our spouse's hearts if we're called to that. And timing is everything, right? As you said, if you had met at any other time, it probably wouldn't have worked because you were just not spiritually where you needed to be. And the same is true for our story. So it's just a matter of entrusting the whole story to God from beginning to end, and just praying for God's will in that. How can women cultivate spiritual motherhood, whether they're physical mothers or not, but how can they cultivate spiritual motherhood in their own lives?
Yeah, that is the question that we all wrestle with. I think what I've found is patience. It's a lot of looking to Our Lady. And again, she played such a huge part in my conversion, my healing of that feminine rift that had been formed by my involvement in the errors of feminism and the ideology of destructive modern feminism. And what I found in her and what I continue to find in her is, again, nothing but strength, right? It's nothing but this quiet and beautiful strength, because she's unwavering in her gaze at the Father, at God the Father. She's unwavering. And so she's not relying on anything that she can do apart from God. Everything is a cooperation with God. And I think that that is the strength that we as maternal Christian women possess is this constant gaze that's unwavering towards the Father and this endless desire to cooperate with him in his work that, I mean, we want to give. That is our desire. The desire of our soul as women is to give and give more. And I know that one of the questions is always with women, especially women that have high capacities or doing a lot, balancing a lot with, work or children or passions or whatever it is, volunteering or, it sometimes, I mean, I'm amazed by other women. Maybe they're amazed by me. I don't know. Maybe we're all amazed by each other. But sometimes it does seem like we're restless and never satisfied with gifting ourselves, right? Is this, we have this immense desire to give more to our spouse, to give more to our children. Am I doing enough? Am I giving enough? Am I satisfying enough spiritually? Like, am I praying enough? Am I sacrificing enough? Like, am I gifting myself enough? And that, I think, for women is that we do have this desire to constantly gift ourselves. And of course, that can go in the wrong way. It can be too much. And that's a discernment to make sure that we're not, tipping the scales or taking the improper order of our lives from giving to God, giving to our spouse, giving to our children, giving to others out of proportion. But I think that as maternal women, we can constantly cultivate our self gift, make sure that is ordered, that we are giving to God first so that he can cooperate, that we can cooperate with him. If we're not listening to him, then we're just operating. We're not cooperating. We're just, taking it on our own. And then allowing him to form us into who he wants us to be. Because again, there's so much comparison with women. That's another weakness that Edith Stein again talks about, that we tend to look at others, we tend to gossip, we tend to want to bring others down because we can't find our own place in the gaze of Christ. We are looking at others and wanting to be in their place, in their light, in their, vocation. And so it is hard. It's hard when you're in a vocation that maybe is challenging, or if you're in a state such as the single state and you want to be in a vocation of marriage or religious life and doors are not opening for you. I think that you really said it well, though, with the fact that we need to always be cultivating our maternal spirit, is to look at patience, waiting on God's timing, and how am I doing the will of God today? How am I allowing God to form me today? How am I allowing God to form my maternal heart for others? Have I been open and receptive to him? Have I been open and receptive to others? How have I gifted myself today? And has it been in a way that God has asked me to, or have I just made that decision outside of God's will for my day and my vocation in my life? And those are all really hard because, especially for me, I want to go, go, go and make decisions and jump on my horse and go to Orleans, let's go, let's charge, let's not wait. And so again, we look to Joan, we look to these female saints always waiting. She wasn't always waiting. She wasn't only waiting on the King of Kings, on the Lord to tell her what to do, but then she had to wait on this secular king who was not a man of high virtue and not a man of elevated will and, goodwill towards her, or courage, or when we look again at these male attributes, these strong male attributes, we don't see him as a temperate, manly king. as Aquinas would say, manly and temperate would be strong-minded in overcoming those overindulgent pleasures. We don't see him as that man who's willing to stand up and fight. And yet, Joan subjected herself to him as well. And we have to look at all those examples and say, am I following in the way that God has laid out for me? Am I being led by my maternal heart?
And how do you do it all? You're a mom of 5, you're an author, you're a podcaster. How do you strike that work-life balance with a family, with a husband, and all the duties and responsibilities of being a wife and a mother?
I would say that is a great question. It's a question that I always ask people. So, Arena, you took that. And I look at other women, I look at you, I look at other women, and I ask the same question, especially women that have more kids than I do, are, writing more books than I am, are maybe professors and lecturers. And I'm wondering, do they have more time in their day? Do they have more capacity? What is it? Sometimes again, I find myself getting into that comparison trap where I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I have to do more. I put pressure on myself to need to do more. And then those are the times where I really do have to step back and say, Lord, what are you asking of me? Because a lot of times when I do forge forward on my own, it fails. It doesn't work. The doors don't open. And I wind up just running into that closed door over and over again and just kind of like slamming my head against it until I realize it's not going to open by me or by my own will. It's going to open in God's time. And again, as in the vocation of waiting for my husband, there was 5 long years of waiting, very actively and intentionally praying before the Lord really did reveal him to me. And I did waver in my faith as to whether he was really going to come or not, or whether the Lord really was going to bring that to fruition in my life. I think the same way in other things, there are seasons. Looking back, there are seasons where I have felt that everything balanced so well, where I felt like my marriage was very strong and I was giving to my kids what they needed. And I was really being fulfilled in my writing and podcasting and doing different things. And I felt that everything was at such a good equilibrium and balance, and that the Lord was just seamlessly opening doors. And then there have been other seasons, and maybe people don't talk about these as much, but I'm here to tell you that there have definitely been very, very hard seasons where I have felt that those things were completely out of whack, that I was not getting enough time in prayer, and I felt very distant and far from the Lord. And I felt like I was in a season of desolation. And I was wondering if I was spiritually doing what was right for my soul. Was I doing what the Lord was asking, or was he putting me at an arm's length so that I would draw closer to him in that area? There have been times where I've felt more distant from my husband, like I'm doing too much and I'm not spending enough time with him. We're not working enough to build our marriage, to, keep date nights sacred or time together. We're just like passing ships in the night, and it's not healthy for our marriage. There's been times where I felt like the kids are not getting enough time from me or what they need. And during those seasons, inevitably, if there's a passion or a desire that I have, whether it be writing or podcasting or speaking, suddenly those doors begin to close. And no matter what I do on my part to try to rip those doors open or make those things happen, they start slamming in my face. And a lot of times I don't realize why until the whole house starts crumbling down. My whole structure starts crumbling. And so I am definitely here to tell you that I don't think that having it all looks in this way, that you're constantly on this perpetual stride of doing everything, having a good marriage, having a good spiritual life, having a good relationship with your children, and producing all of these things, whatever it is that you would like to produce in the world or outside of the home. I do think that the Lord calls us to seasons. He sees our heart. He recognizes our passions and our desires. He wants to cooperate with us. He knows that we desire to gift ourselves in so many ways. And I think that we, again, just need to be receptive and open, because there are going to be seasons where he says, hey, your marriage needs work, or hey, you have not seen me in adoration for like a year now, and you used to be here every week, or your child is at a different stage. They no longer are going to sleep at this time. Now they're up for 5 more hours, or they're teenagers and they really need to talk through some heavy things. And there's also people that, just to give you a very secular example, Joanna Gaines, I remember loving her show Fixer Upper, and her husband did that show together of remodeling houses. And then all of their kids started to hit this preteens to teens time period. And they basically said, we're quitting the show because our kids need us and they don't find that we have enough time for them. And I thought, as a just secular example of someone who's very popular and an influencer, that to me meant a lot, that the two of them stepped away from something that they enjoyed, something that brought them a lot of money and popularity, to make this intentional respite with their children throughout those next few years. And as we see, she's still very active. They're both still very active. And so God didn't say, hey, if you quit this show, there will be nothing else. You will never be successful. There will be no other open doors for you. And I think that's the lie, that if we stop the wheel from rolling, that it will never pick back up again, or God will never use us, or if we're not ready in action, armored, standing next to our horse, there will never be another battle for us. We'll be retired. And that is the perpetual lie that we fear as women, is that our gift will not be used, our gift will not be needed, our gift will not be received. And so I think it's just recognizing and listening to where our gift is most needed at that season, and how we can do that, and when we need to step back in certain areas, and when we need to give more.
Mm-hmm. So you end the book with hope. What gives you confidence that motherhood can indeed be redeemed in our time?
I think that because God lives and because he reigns, right? Everything we already know will be redeemed, is redeemed. The Blessed Mother was a real human being who walked this earth, and she stands forever as an example to us as women of the perfection of maternity and what our maternal nature can do in cooperation with God, which he desires for each one of us. And I know that because of all of those truths, that it is redeemed already, it is being redeemed, and each one of us has a part in that redemption that we are called to. And as soon as we do open ourselves and allow ourselves to receive our marching orders from the Lord, again, that could just be the quote that is associated often with Mother Teresa: if you want to change the world, go home and love your family. That's something that gets thrown around a lot. But if we really sit with that and think about it, to me, I remember thinking initially that it seemed so trite. How can me going home and loving my family really do anything to change the world? I need to do something bigger, bolder, louder and more aggressive than just loving my family. And I understand that my children are going to go out and be the next generation, and it goes in that form. But still, there's got to be gloves for me to put on in some trenches somewhere. And again, we really need to disarm that way of thinking in ourselves constantly, because we do live in a very masculine society. And what I mean by that is the United States is a society that does constantly tell us that we should be climbing the ladder, that we should be wanting more esteem, more notoriety, more fame, more money, more security, more comfort. And it's very hard to separate ourselves as Americans from that way of thinking. And so the idea of just going home and pouring everything into our husband, our home, our children is still hard for us to fully accept as American women, that that is truly where we can make the biggest difference. But I think it's in looking to things like that again and allowing ourselves to be disconnected from what our society tells us over and over and over again, day in and day out, in this messaging that we are all plugged into, no matter how active or inactive we are on social media, and to instead plug more deeply into the voice of the church, the saints, the doctors of the church, plugging into more of those voices and the silent voice of the Blessed Mother, the example of the Blessed Mother. That is the way in which we will truly redeem ourselves and redeem maternal nature in society through the example of how our husbands will go out and interact with the world, how our children will go out and interact with the world and embrace the world, and how, others that encounter us, when we look to certain saints, a lot of times they're so unknown by the world at large. Even Padre Pio, when I look at him, he was pretty well recognized in his time as far as a saint. He's in the late 60s. There's newspapers, there's photography, there's a lot of word of mouth and ways to travel to access him. But he's in this little friary in Italy for most of his life. He's not on social media or out there writing articles in newspapers. There's no way to know Padre Pio other than word of mouth, other than people telling about what's happening with him. It's not even that he's traveling from parish to parish and giving great sermons or, doing different retreats or anything like that. So God often brings people out into the desert to these hermits, right? To St. Francis. A lot of times you see that these monks are trying to escape from people, right? They're going out into the desert, they're hiding, they just want to be in their cave and to pray, and they're being called into social life. They're being called to lead a monastery. They're being called to be pope. They're being called into these ways of leading people that they don't want, but God is calling them there. And I think that we often don't wait for God to call us to lead. We want to lead and God to support us on that.
Right. Lastly, this question is both for you and also for the listener. If you could speak to your pre-conversion self and to someone who finds herself in that mode, what would you most want to tell her about femininity and motherhood now that you're on the other side?
Oh my gosh, so much. So one of the sad realities of my past is that a lot of the women, this gets asked to me a lot when I do retreats or share my testimony or give talks to women. one of the questions near the end is always, what happened to all of those other women? You know, the group of friends that I had pre-conversion, the other women that were in this feminist faction that we had. And sadly, when I look back at a lot of the friends that I had, the women that I knew now who are all the same age as I am now, there are very, very few women that I graduated from high school with, that I knew in that time period of high school, early 20s, that have gone on to have children. Now, some of them have gotten married or had certain kind of partnerships, you know, maybe a non-marital partnership, but many of them have intentionally chosen not to have children, regardless of being with someone for more than 10 years. And I see that as a direct manifestation of the ideology that was accepted, perpetuated, and they have continued to accept and regurgitate. And now, you know, going forward in their late 30s, 40s, these women have never been open to life, never been open to their maternity, either physically or spiritually. And I see the effects in their life, not only a lot of loneliness and, you know, some women are still happy. They believe in that state. They still believe in that teaching and they don't have regrets, but yet there's others who do have deep regrets and find that that regret comes late and sometimes too late to change, especially in the sense of physically and biologically having children of your own, accepting that in your own life and accepting a vocation of marriage and family and children. So I think I'll start with saying that is the sadness of seeing the effects of a lot of the women that I befriended during that time period. And then um as far as what I would say to myself, first of all, I'm so thankful to the Lord that I have a different future. You know, that I was able to receive that message from of truth so early on, and that I was able to experience that healing and to go on to embrace what God truly desired for me, both a formation of my spiritual motherhood, but also accepting the vocation as wife and mother of these 5 children, these beautiful souls, to be able to accept that and to find my greatest joy and deepest fulfillment in that vocation that He's called me, in this awakening of my motherhood on so many levels because of that. And if I was able to go back and talk to my pre-conversion self, I would certainly try to, again, drive home the point that women have such an elevated status of dignity, worth, and value in the eyes of God. And that is primary because nothing else really matters. All of the other effects of that are secondary. How others see you, which is very important when you're a teen, when you're coming of age, when you're going through so many transformations in your life. What others think of you and how they see you and how they respond to you are so important to us. But without seeing ourselves through the eyes of God, all of that is going to be superficial. A lot of times it's going to be influenced by what is false, by what is judgmental. And all of those things are going to cause us to truly transmorph into something that we aren't. And I know that looking back on that time, and seeing myself as not feminine and embracing all of these masculine attributes. Had I been in high school right now, maybe I would have been confused as to being born in the wrong body or being masculine, or maybe needing to make a change, alteration to my chemical or physical body. And thank God that wasn't presented at that time, or that confusion wasn't introduced into my thought process at the time. So I think fundamentally it would be to try to convince her of a relationship and a love of the one who created her, and to lean so deeply into that and try to put all of my energy into pursuing that and to exploring that truth, and allow all the voices of the world to go on silent mode. I like to think, again, Romans 12:2, to keep that at the forefront of our minds, that do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may prove what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And again, I think about that all the time, because we are so easily conformed to the world. And, every day I think that, wow, am I being conformed to the world? Am I listening to the voices of the world? And you need to check in on that. But to truly desire to be transformed by the renewal of your mind in Christ and in line with your unique call, I think that's something that we don't hear. I certainly didn't hear it at that point in my life, that I have a unique call, that I'm special in the eyes of God, that I don't have to claw my way to the top, because He already has something in mind for me that is so much bigger than anything I could imagine. If someone would have told me that, I don't know what I would have done with myself. I mean, my heart would have been bursting with joy and excitement that there's something so big for me out there. There's something so beautiful for me out there. And there's not enough young women that know that truth about their lives.
Well, thank you so much for your witness, for your yes to motherhood, both the physical and spiritual yes, and to becoming a wife and a mother, and also for sharing your experience and wisdom so candidly with us. We really appreciate it, Kimberly.
Thanks so much for having me, Irina. This has been such a joy to be with you today.
For me as well. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Bioethics Babe podcast. If you've enjoyed this content, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and your favorite podcast platform, and share with your friends and family. Also check out bioethicsbabe.com for the latest episodes and resources.